Bomo, kot se spodobi, pogovarjali o prihodnosti socializma, ob izdaji knjige Komunizem v gibanju, avtorice Catherine Samary, s predgovorom, ki ga je napisal Marko Kržan, izšla pa je konec lanskega leta pri Založbi CF. Naj začetek vsem povem, da se knjiga prodaja v predverju in sicer po znižani ceni 16 €, ki jo boste lahko po končanem dogodku kupili. Na začetku bom na kratko predstavila naša sogovornika danes, Catherine Samary, ki je doktorirala iz ekonomije leta 1986 z področja zgodovine samoupravljanja v Jugoslaviji. Njena doktorska teza je še isto leto izšla pod naslovom Le marché contre l'autogestion, trg proti samoupravljanju. In isto leto je išlo tudi besedilo Plan, trg in demokracija, ki je objavljeno tudi kot zadnje besedilo v tej knjigi in vam ga resnično priporočam v branje, ker je izjemna analiza primerjave z razpravami o prehodu iz kapitalizma v socializem takoj po oktobrski revoluciji in z razpravami v Jugoslaviji v 60-ih letih. Avtorica se je tudi pozneje še ukvarjala in spremljala stanje v Jugoslaviji. Leta 1995 je šla knjiga v angleščini Jugoslavia Dismembered, razpad Jugoslavije. In še malo pozneje, leta 2008, Jugoslavie de la décomposition en jeu européen, Jugoslavija od razpada do evropskih zastavitev. Zelo odmerno analizo o krizi v Sloveniji po letu 2008-2009 pa je objavila v časopisu Imperkon in razni povzetki so bili objavljeni tudi v slovenskih časopisih, na primer Dnevniku. In to analizo je predstavila takrat tudi v Ljubljani. Catherine Samary je do upokojitve predavala na Pariški Université Dauphine, predmet ekonomije, in slovenski publiki je znana tudi po predavanjih na Delavsko-Hankarski univerzi in pozneje Inštitutu za delavske študije. Drugi moj sogovornik je Marko Kržan, ki je doktoriral iz sociologije na Filozofski fakulteti leta 2016, če se prav spomnim. Nalogo je objavil tudi isto leto z naslovom Marksova teorija vrednosti in razredov, ki je šla pri Založbi Sofija. Je ustanovni član Iniciative za demokratični socializem, svetovalec, če je to pravilni naziv stranke Levica, in kot sam pravi politični delavec. Zdaj bom pa preskočila na angleščino. Now I switch to the English so that our guest, Catherine Samary, can understand. Marko Kržan also contributed an excellent preface to the book, which really complemented the historical analysis of Catherine Samary and even strengthened some hypotheses proposed by the author. Now I will launch the debate with my first question, and I'm sure that both speakers today will answer in their short 20 minutes long exposés. And my question relates to many opinions from economists and politicians that market reforms in the 60s were a bright moment in the dark history of the socialism. The thesis defended in the book by Catherine Samary is completely opposite. She says that the market reform, or the period of market socialism from 1965 to 1971, was one of the important reasons for the failure of self-management in Yugoslavia and possibly also of the Yugoslavia as the state. I will read two excerpts from the book first in the Slovensko, so you can easily follow, and then in the English. The authors in the book says, Jugoslavijo je med drugim pokopalo prav to, da se je neširoko odprla zdravi konkurenci, prav to, da je menila, da je konkurenca zdrava. In malo naprej pravi, jugoslovanska bilanca je zato paradoksna. Logiko tržnih reform v prid samoupravljanju je pripeljala do odprave samoupravljanja. In ta dva odlomka v angleščini. Jugoslavia's crisis is all the sharper that it opened itself wide to healthy competition, that it assumed precisely that the latter was strictly healthy. Our balance sheet will therefore be paradoxical. The logic of pro-self-management market reforms leads to the elimination of self-management. In malo naprej pravi v knjigi ta odlomek je zelo kompleksen in ne moram vseh argumentov, ki stojijo za njim, razložiti, zato vas resnično vabim k odlomku k branju celega besedila Plan, trg in demokracija v knjigi, vendar pa glavno poanto bomo iz tega odlomka dobili. Ekonomska enota blaga je utelešala trojno oceno o stroških potrebah in o družbenih odnosih. V postsocializmu je treba uvesti družbeni nadzor nad temi tremi področji, tako da bodo tehnike denarnega beleženja stroškov in potreb podrejene splošnim družbenim odločitvam o ciljih. Ali v angleščini, in English, in the same way as the commodity, as the basic economic cell incorporates a threefold judgment on costs, needs, and social relations, social control extends its way over these three fields. But the techniques for reporting costs and inventorying needs must be subordinated to overall social choices. The author also says in the book that democracy should become the fourth productive factor besides labor force, natural resources and means of production, and that control over the crucial decisions, socio-economic decision was the basic reason cause for the failure of self-management and later of Yugoslavia. Now I leave the floor to Catherine Samary for her exposé and later to Marko Kržan. Please.
Hvala lepo, dobar dan. Sorry, I will not continue in Slovenian language. Hopefully, the English is not my native language neither, so that's an equalitarian relationship with you. Thank you first very much to Rasko, to Maja, for the translation, which is really impressive work.
May I say one remark because I forgot. Yeah. The editor of the book was Razpravo, so he has a strong or big credit for this book, for the selection of texts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the huge work, and thank you very much, Marko, for the contribution. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity of a dialogue here. So, I propose to put my introduction under the prophecy of George Orwell, to illustrate why it is important for me and broader people, I hope, to come back on the Yugoslav experience. Orwell, writing his book 1984, which could have been, which title could have been 1989. Anyway, he said those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And that is the issue. Speaking of the present, I mean a very broad sense of those who control the globalized world, the system which has been built since the beginning, in fact before 89, since the beginning of the 80s in core capitalist countries, and then radicalized after 89 to build a globalized system which needs to control precisely the present in order to forbid any kind of progressive interpretation of the past. The past, shortly, is mainly all revolutionary upsurge which occurred in what Hobsbawm called the short 20th century, and which could be also called the Octobers or the Soviet century, but that is the century of revolutions, with their assets, with their progress, with their dramas, with their faults, with their mistakes, and with their failures. But with a very important element, which was the beginning of an attempt to change the world in the context of the big structural crisis of the capitalist system, and with, I am an old six-eighter, and in that period in the world, youth, without a consistent answer and program, express a radical aspiration against all relationship of oppression. And I think this is still, it could be still deeper today, because even women's issues, racist issues, can be more deeply integrated. So, among the counter-revolutionary trend of the present is the attempt to control the past, the interpretation of the past. So the need to commonize the past in a progressive sense. It's on the point of view of those who were involved and would support the revolutionary, I would say, a concrete utopia of the revolutions, is a real democratic, intellectual and social fight, part of the fight. So, to be directly on my interpretation and to be short, you will have to tell me in order that I choose. I want first to begin with, I will answer your question. I want first to begin with a remark on the fact that, of course, the Yugoslav revolution was under the pressure, the constraint of international context. And there are many interpretations, I don't want to go into the direct discussion of that, but which consider that international conditions were the determinant of the national choices, and that the whole interpretation comes from the international context. I, of course, do believe that we cannot at all ignore the pressure of international context, but I put the emphasis on the national roots, because precisely one of the lessons of the Yugoslav, a very small country, the capacity of resistance to international context is the first asset of the Yugoslav. And I do believe that the Yugoslav system could not resist both, first, to fascism and international reactionary forces involved in the Second World War, but also to the pressure of Yalta agreements and to Stalin in the context, if it was not rooted in the very popular and real revolution. That doesn't give answers to how to build positivity, but it is very important. So my focus is on, of course, there are causes of the failure which belongs to the international pressures and context, but I would put the emphasis on the international asset. And I will begin with something which puts me close to the way, I don't know if you know Michael Leibovitz's elaboration on the issues of real socialism and so on. He speaks, he tries to explain the life of the regime, the past regime of a socialist, so-called socialist system, through the articulation of the role of the vanguard party and social contract. Well, I don't want to discuss this here in detail, but I think for the Yugoslav case, the idea that the Yugoslav experience is a combination of both social movement and mass actors, I will precise, and of course of political actors, that was the role of the communist party, is a really important fact. And the question I raise as a point of beginning departure is what were the social, what were the base of the legitimacy of the system for several decades. And I do believe that it was rooted first in the Avnoy meeting during the Second World War of the liberation committees, permitting to resist to Yalta agreement and to the decision to leave Yugoslavia in the western side and with the king coming back and so on, but rooted in the organization with two kinds of actors, to be short, and two kinds of promises, giving at the beginning of a social contract, that is the national issue and the social issue. The national issue for me is not at all to be reduced to nationalism. I think national rights, national freedom of unity, national self-determination, and unity in a free association of different people is a key reason of the victory against a prison of nations, that was the first Yugoslavia, or again any kind of oppression of nation. It is not to be identified with nationalism, that is putting its own nation against the other and putting above the other or above social or democratic issues. Second dimensions, the social dimension is broad too, because as you know better than me, peasants were part of course, the victory and the mobilization of peasant workers, intellectuals. So the social issue was, of course, broad, and but the idea to mobilize what some call the dominated classes and subaltern classes, and to control the issue was, of course, a key element. So the broad mobilization, even the popular army and liberation committees, was very important. And it is because of the combination of rights and promises and concrete utopia linked to the mobilization of different nations and social actors, massively peasant workers, intellectuals, in those liberation committees and so on, that the Communist Party and partisan could resist to Yalta and could resist to the... But, therefore, then, there is the issue of, which is absolutely without any recipe, which was without any recipe for the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and which is still without recipe. How do you organize a society with those promises of improving social situations, social life, working conditions, and national rights? I think the second element of the social contract which defined the whole Yugoslav system occurred in '48 with a split with Stalin, which was articulated with the revolution, resisting to Stalin on many aspects, but still with many illusions on what would be the Soviet aid and so on. So the split in '48, with the introduction of workers' council and self-management, is part of what I call the social contract, because it gives a certain content of the two aspects I've said, that is social rights and national rights. self-management. Self-management, but it means then two sets of issues. That is, what political system which could permit to combine self-management rights at the level of factories, social sector, and so on, with national rights. And what role of party, political organization, what role of trade union, what transformation of the state, what transformation of the planning system of the market. So what political economy to satisfy both constraints of the social contract. My thesis is that, I don't understand Slovenian, but I understand what you said. Because you said that my thesis was produced under the title The Market Against Self-Management, and you rightly say that I present the market reform as a real problem for self-management. I will come back on that. But it is a real simplification. The real title of my thesis was The Contradictory Logic of the Yugoslav system and reforms. And I want to come back, 68, in the 60s, it was using the delay of time and of experience, just in the middle, between 48 and 89. And it was an accumulation of experience. But first, accumulation of theoretization against Soviet kind of planning and of so-called organization, a socialist organization of ownership. And this was the rejection of the planning system. But in the period of 1950 up to 65, so the system of planning still existed, but on new forms. I think it's a very important period. We will discuss this afterwards, but still the fonds, which was the concretization of the maintenance of planned orientation to redistribution of resources and try to industrialize the part of the country which was not industrialized, that is to try and reduce inequalities. And for nations and for social actors, reduction of inequalities is a real issue. So planning and funds were still needed. How do you combine them with self-management? At that time, self-management was only co-management at the level of factories, and planning was through the funds, but the funds were controlled not in the democratic way. They were controlled by the party state and through economic instruments. And it's not because it is using economic instruments to push people to for instance, you use certain kind of prices, indexes, taxes, and so on, which are determined with planned purposes. But it is not because you use prices and index or instead of administrative order that it is democratic. So the big choices were not under real control of democracy. So if you come to the real turning point in 65 and the market reform, I think behind the market reform, you had three kinds of trends which are not to be presented as pro-capitalist. Even if within the reform, within the country and within the process, you could also have pro-capitalist forces or currents, I think they were marginal at that time, not so strong. So the main reason for the reform was not a decision of the party to introduce capitalism. The main reason were rational reason coming out of the social contract. Why? First, because the question, how do you redistribute the resources, raises the issue that you would have in any kind of union, in the European Union, in the Spanish state, in any kind of country where you have uneven development and multinational components, how do you combine national rights and redistribution without being understood by the richest countries as a form of exploitation? This is a concrete issue, and there was the pressure of a part of the richest, that is Slovenian and Croatian, of course, a component of Yugoslavia, not to restore capitalism, but to break with the redistribution of resources, thinking if we have better control of our own resources, we will be more efficient, and then we can help more the other one. This did in general don't function like that, but that was a real argument and pressure, which is not capitalism. How do you answer to this? Second, does it mean that I have already spoken 15 minutes?
15.
Oh, yes. The second pressure is on self-management. And the rational, anti-bureaucratic defense of self-management right is to destroy planning when planning seems to be bureaucratic and non-democratic. So you have at that moment the possibility of change the form of planning in order to socialize planning and introduce self-management control within the planning forms, for instance, and so on. But the choice to introduce market was not identified with the capitalist restoration or something against self-management. It was associated with the idea we will have in the factory more control on the higher part on our own labor. And it is rational. But the third component, and I want to put emphasis on this because it's completely underestimated, in particular among Marxists, among the radical left, and in the debate. That is the economic debate. Since the 20s, I mean, you have no consensus among Marxists, even among anarchists, like that. But anyway, among Marxists, let us say, on what is the role of market in the socialist transformation. Since the 20s, in the Soviet Union, you had a debate among Marxists, and some would say anti-capitalist transformation means the suppression of the domination of capitalist ownership. And then you can use market. And you can use market, and you should use the law of value in a theoretical sense. You should use the market and the law of value in order to have a rational form of economy. And you have a part of the economists who believe in this, and who believed in that. And it's still and it was the debate precisely, and it's not to be identified with pro-capitalist. I think it is an error to think that a self-managed socialist system can use the same tools as the capitalist one, and that it can be in the sphere of decision-making, which is dominated by market prices. It's a completely limited horizon. You have a democratic self-management system must be organized with not to suppress any market and the use of certain money, but to suppress financial market, to suppress the role of capital market, but also to introduce criteria of efficiency, of evaluation of what is cost, what is waste, what is needed in the sphere of concrete used value, which permits democracy. Because if you use priority for education, priority for health, for care for everyone, use of our own resources, not to be dependent on the world system for energy, and so on and so forth. These are used values and choices, concrete choices, combined with criteria of efficiency, where you put nothing of a market and prices and money, but human issues. That is relationship between men and women, between people, between nations, between all the components, peasants and workers. And this is, and so to finish with this, I think that at that period, and I leave for the discussion, at the period of the, why do I think that 68 was still a turning point? Because the revolutionary impact was still important, and in the consciousness, pro-socialist current were dominant even among youth, internationalist also approaches and so on. So when I say it was a turning point, I think Yugoslavia was at a crossing road. I don't mean that there were the conditions for a progressive answer, victorious progressive answer at that time. There were, but some element did exist, and rethinking what was lacking is important in order to resist to any kind of fatal interpretation. That is because of self-management that was the failure. No, it is not because of self-management that it was the failure. It is neither because of national feelings and defending of rights that there was the failure. It is because those two combined set of problems conflicting didn't find the space, organized space, which would permit trade unions, political currents within the party or outside the party, students, non-organized people, citizens, to put together an analysis, a balance sheet of the reforms. What has been the problem with the banking system, with the technocracy, with the market, with external relationship and so on? What have been the, what are the right, what do we want to defend? What do we want to protect together? And then what kind of answer can we give to what is the crisis? That is to give a democratic places. There was a Congress of self-manager, but it was controlled from above, from the top. And there was no real space which would permit to fight against the real trends toward capitalist restoration and pressure from international markets on the Yugoslav system. So I will stop here. I suppose it's finished? Yes. I leave for the discussion the possibility of illustrating what I do think were perhaps 3 words, if I can. I would say that in that period, from my point of view, something which was expressed both in the praxis current or in the party or in trade unions, and were elements to overcome the difficulty. First, the idea of the CEs, community of interest, self-managed community of interest, which permit to enlarge the notion of self-management not only to producer, but to user, producer at different territorial level and linked to concrete issue. Second, chambers of self-management, but it was simply introduced at the local and republican level, not at the federal level, because of nationalist pressure against a federal self-management dealing of the crisis. And third, self-management planning. But if you propose to a basic unit to elaborate a plan through contract, but with an horizon which is dominated by market and local experience, you cannot build any planning in a consistent way. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Before we proceed, I would like to note that you will have a chance to pose your questions right after the expose of Marko Kržan. So please think about your questions later on. Marko, what is yours?
Thank you. Before I begin, I would invite the people who are standing there to take a seat. There are still some couple of chairs left. And
we are so far young.
Okay. I will start with a disclaimer. It is very hard to say something meaningful about Yugoslav socialist self-management in 20 minutes. And there are not only chronological but also social and objective conditions. First of all, especially in the young audience like this one, there is a severe lack of knowledge of even factual history of Yugoslavia after 45. And second of all, what people do know tends to be obscured by the dominant ideology, which is anti-communist. So the importance of Catherine's work and our translation of it is to a certain degree in the fact that it deconstructs some of the ideological notions that we use, or the media, even social scientists use, to describe and explain Yugoslav history. So what I will try to do in this 20 minutes is to give you just a very, very small conceptual apparatus for understanding what was going on, and then try to explain what those theoretical concepts mean on the concrete example of Yugoslav self-management or its development. It has had different phases, and these different phases show us different paths from capitalism to a post-socialist society that could become socialist or communist, because those societies, which we call real existing socialisms, were not in any way, I would say, socialist or communist societies. Even they usually did not even proclaim themselves to be, but were transitional post-capitalist societies that had the aim, at least officially, to establish socialism or communism. So the first thing that you have to understand, if you want to understand socialism and even capitalism, is that capitalism is not, that the opposition between capitalism and socialism cannot be reduced to opposition between market economy and planning or planned economy. Because, as you probably know, there have been societies which were not capitalist but had substantial markets operating within them, and there used to be class societies, exploitative class societies, which had a planning economy as well. For instance, you know that in feudal societies, in slave owner societies, you would have certain areas of market trade, especially between communities and on the margins of communities. And maybe the majority of the population would live in conditions of, let's say, a small peasant type of production, even exchanging their goods and products, but the system as a whole would be dominated by planning, which those type of society meant managing the most important productive factor, and that was the land. So in Egypt, or ancient Egypt, ancient China, societies like that, you will have a planned economy, but which was by no means a socialist economy. Planning was used in order to reproduce the class society and the privileges of the caste of the bureaucracy that was in charge of the, let's say, planning. It was also not rational, but that's a secondary question. And of course, you also have to be aware that Marx never defined capitalism as simply as market economy, because he knew that those forms of commodity producing or market economies existed in previous social formations, and that it is only when certain types of markets developed, you switch or you the society gets transformed from what he called simple commodity production or pre-capitalist forms of commodity production into true capitalism. And this turning point is the formations of markets of labor force, markets of capital, and markets of land. Capital would mean money, or also physical capital, and land in a broad sense is the most important productive factor, not only for agriculture, but also for mining, etc. You know that Marx studied this in the classical case of England, with the process of primitive accumulation, which not only spread the market for commodities, which you would buy like for your means for living, like food, certain things, but also market of capital. What happened was the peasants were evicted from their lands. The land was appropriated by the aristocracy, and this aristocracy now landed the land which he did not want to manage anymore to capitalist tenants. So what developed was a relationship between capitalist tenants and their workers, who became wage workers. They had nothing else to sell but their labor force. And on the other hand, there was the aristocracy, which extracted rent because it landed, because it was able to give the land in order to the capitalist tenants for exploitation. So that's the important thing. You should not confuse socialism with simply a planned economy, nor capitalism simply with market economy. And this is very important precisely because what Catherine said before, you can have market mechanisms in socialist societies or transitional societies to socialism to a certain point. And my contribution in this afterword was to identify that point where market socialism turns into kind of capitalism or defunct capitalism, as I call it, because it does not have all the specifics or the features of capitalism, but it has the most important ones. So it functions like, for instance, a peripheral, underdeveloped capitalist country. It has certain, most of the features of capitalism, but it does not have the results that a certain developed capitalist economy would have. And this turning point where socialist market economy turns into a capitalist economy is the creation of what Polanyi said called fictitious commodities. So not only when you don't only have market for commodities, but you also have market for capital, and to some extent market for land and labor force. That's my first methodological point, which I will now try to demonstrate by describing the development of Yugoslav self-management. But before I do that, just just one more thought. I think, and this is, I tried to show this in my afterword, that the questions which were posed to Yugoslav society or to Soviet society after the revolution, or every post-capitalist society after the revolution, are universal. Their answers, of course, depend on the international and historical circumstances in which the revolution and transition take place, but nevertheless, the basic economic questions that have to be solved, the way how to manage the economy, remain the same. And I think that the development of Yugoslav self-management can be, let's say, divided into 3 or 4 distinct phases or types that I think correspond to 3 main ways of how we imagine a socialist or a communist society, or at least a society that would that would try to establish socialism. And I also think that this is the relevancy of the book and of the questions of Yugoslav history for the socialist movement or anti-capitalist movements today. We have a lot of people, especially in the West, activists and theoreticians, who are building these imagined models and trying to simulate what would happen in a hypothetical socialist society. That's okay, although it's not a Marxist method, that's a Robinson Crusoe method of methodological individualism. This is mainly done by bourgeois economists and sociologists, but still even some Marxists, like analytical Marxists, do use that. But what I'm proposing to these people is take a look at those real life experiments which were done in a much larger scale, and then maybe you will learn more than from these imagined or constructed cases. Now, to try to wrap up the history of Yugoslav self-management, or at least the first three of its 4 phases, in 10 minutes, I will try to divide it into 3 phases and give it the names which were given by Menzinger, the local economists. Pretty much everyone agrees about these periodizations. Okay, the years, concrete years can be different, but basically this is how it was done. So, after the Second World War, until let's say 1951, there was a phase of administrative or bureaucratic socialism of the, let's say, Soviet type. After that period, for let's say from 51 was the introduction, or 50 was the introduction of the self-management in the first enterprises. Then you had a period of, let's say, administrative, self-managed socialism until, let's say, 65, when there was this market reform which you were asking us about. And this period lasted until 71, when the reform was blocked, and we will see why the reform had to be blocked. So the first period is the period of reconstruction after the war. The basic mechanism of economic coordination was planning. The agents of planning was a special social group that we might call bureaucracy. The planning organs had the authority and means to plan or to direct even day-to-day decisions, economic decisions of the enterprises. So, what would be produced, how would be produced, how the income of the company or of the enterprise would be divided, and also how many funds would be used for, let's say, consumption goods, and how much would be spent for future investment or accumulation. Nevertheless, this society was, of course, not socialist. There was a specific social group, bureaucracy, that was dominant, but this group did not develop into a specific class, mainly because what was, let's say, good for the reproduction of this class, of this group of people, their privileges and their material status was detrimental to the reproduction or the development of the economic system as such. This is one of the differences between this kind of system and capitalism, because the individual, what is good for individual capitalism is basically also good for capitalism as such. The logic which guides the behavior of the individual capitalist is also the logic that drives this non-limited accumulation of capital. Well, we have to, I would just say that during this time, which ended in 48, Yugoslavia achieved quite remarkable economic recovery. The national product in physical terms was, I think, 350% of what it was in the last year before the war, 1933. And also, as Catherine has mentioned, Yugoslavia managed to not only to build an industrial and economic base which the kingdom of Yugoslavia, the pre-war Yugoslavia and its bourgeoisie was never able to do, it was also able to achieve, let's say, independence in external politics. This was most, as Catherine also said, it was able to resist the deal between the Soviet Union and the Western imperialists done in Yalta, who wanted to have an equal influence in Yugoslavia with the king or some kind of coalition government. And in 1948, it was able to resist Stalin and Soviet Union's pressure as well. And the reaction of the Soviet Union and the then Eastern Bloc, the so-called Inform Bureau, which basically kicked Yugoslavia out, the reaction to this was the introduction of the second phase or the second model of socialism, which was, I would call, administrative self-managed socialism. What does this mean? This means that at the level of the enterprise, self-management was introduced. Self-management means that the Workers' Council, a democratic body elected by the whole workers' collective, was the main authority in the enterprise, and that the management, who was of course still there, performing specific functions in the management of the firm, was subjected to the authority of the Workers' Council. And this is very important, and this is very different from what it is in capitalism or what it was like in the bureaucratic kind of socialism, where the director or the manager or the management were appointed from above by the party or by the state apparatus. And it is also different, and for the workers, but the workers were totally subjected to the authority of that management. And it is also different than as in capitalism, where you have management subordinated to a certain extent to the owners, and of course, workers subordinated to the management. So that was a real turn. But the economy does not stop at the level of enterprise. There are certain decisions that have to be taken in the financial system regarding the, let's say, how the capital will be invested, either as credit or as so-called long-term capital that would be invested by the owners. And so the second component of this system was a planning system. This was a system that was able to plan certain and direct the certain general development of the economy, and still have workers autonomously managing their firms. Now, I don't have the time to elucidate on this, maybe we can do it in the discussion, but it turns out that this system, or this model, was the most successful, both in terms of economic performance and, I would say, socialist goals. In terms of economic performance, Yugoslavia was probably the most, the quickest growing economy in the world, or at least in these parts, or at least in Europe at that time. Especially in the industrial sector, especially in the socially owned sector. The agricultural sector was always a problem because it was never fully transformed, and it did, and if you consider it, then the general numbers would be lower. But in any way, the economic performances were impressive, and what is also important, the country was, the inflation was rather low, the exports were growing faster than imports, so there were no external imbalances, as today economists would say. And what is also important, the number of people who were employed, the number of the working class has also grown extensively, which is of course important in a country like Yugoslavia, which was an agricultural country with a lot of surplus population that could not live just in the traditional agriculture. So, however, within this social framework and economic framework, a certain social group gained a lot of power. This group might be called technocracy. This was the management who had now a certain autonomy from the planning authorities, and it had to manage a lot of day-to-day business, and it had certain informations that the workers didn't have, so the workers became more and more dependent on the management. Of course, there was still formally bosses of their own enterprises, but they were not able to practically exercise those powers because they are not informed enough, because they might be misleading, stuff like that. So the very important group emerged. This was the technocracy, and the interest of technocracy was to reintroduce market mechanisms in order for them for their position in the society and their privileges and material status to grow. And here I come to the third phase, the third model that opened with the reform, the market reform of '65. So now, from what I have explained methodologically, you know that it was not about the quantity, but about the quality. It was not about how much market, but which markets that was important. And what took place was the fact that the social capital, so-called, was taken from the funds, from the social funds, which were investing it according to the planning aims and goals, to the banks, which invested capital, mostly credits, but also long-term capital, by the criteria of profitability. So to put it short, a sort of market of capital was established in Yugoslavia, and this market of capital, of course, turned this society, or brought it to a brink of turning from market socialism to a certain form of capitalism. And what happened was that this system suddenly did not achieve such good results economically as the previous model, and second of all, the social consequences of this liberalization, as it was called, were also grave. So, in the previous phase, the technocrats and their representatives in the political class, mostly Vladimir Bakaric, Croatian-born economist, managed to persuade the politicians that what was needed was more market, which meant, of course, the reintroduction of the capital market. And they were saying that this would be the cure for supposed illnesses of the previous economy. They said, well, the inflation is still too high. We should free the economic laws, which meant market laws, capitalist laws. We should we should devalue dinar, the local currency. We should adopt world prices, stuff like that, in order to achieve better results, to have a surplus in the foreign trade and stuff like that. Well, actually, what happened was that all those indicators worsened after this happened. The inflation got higher. The exports start declining and the imports start growing. And what was most important from a social point of view was the growth of employment stopped. It almost grew. I have this information somewhere here in my afterword. I think that the general number of people who were employed in this second phase has increased only for 1%. There were certain years when, in absolute terms, it even decreased. So that was a disastrous thing for a country like Yugoslavia, especially if you take into consideration that this unemployment, socialist unemployment, which is a little bit contradictory and was not usually the case in other socialist countries, this socialist unemployment was very much concentrated in less developed regions such as Kosovo, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. There was, and people from Slovenia, maybe some of you or your parents, grandparents, of course, do not have this experience, because in Slovenia after the Second World War there was 35 years at least of full employment. There were certain times in Croatia as well when there was full employment or something approaching full employment. But in Yugoslavia as a whole, the unemployment grew enormously. So to not be too long, I will just now say what happened then. This reintroduction of certain capitalist markets, like market of capital especially, also limitations of self-management rights, and formalization of the informal power of the technocracy within the companies, with certain amendments to the constitution, have brought this society to a brink of collapse, literally. There was a spread of nationalism, especially in Croatia, so-called mass pop. So when people started to interpret the reasons and causes of the growing disparities between the republics, of the growing unemployment and the large inequality, you have to know that if you give companies and worker collectives the power to basically determine their own wages, and you have large disparities between productivity and certain firms, for instance, if you have a hydroelectrical power plant on a river which is very, very suitable for that thing, like Drava in Slovenia, and some other in a place where this is not the case, then there will be, of course, a natural rent. And if you don't redistribute this rent, then the salaries of the people who are doing the same type of work in this privileged kind of environment will be much larger. And this was the case along the country, of course, in the whole Yugoslav, not only between the republics, but between the regions in the republics and so on. So what happened was that nationalist kinds of ideologies and political movements were very similar to those that we have experienced in the late 80s and early 90s, with the same slogans: who is exploiting who, the same solutions: more market economy, liberalization, free enterprise and stuff like that. Liberalism as well in Slovenia, like Stane Kavčić, brought the country to the brink of dissolution. Let's say, after 1970, the party was still powerful enough to, let's say, block these tendencies of dissolution, but nevertheless was not able, as we will maybe be able to discuss later, to give a new impetus to re-establish the path to socialism again. And this, I think, the point that can be learned from this is, I think there are 2 points. First of all, we are now able to know quite well what should not be done with market mechanisms in a transitionary society from capitalism to socialism, if you don't want to relapse back to capitalism. And secondly, we know now that the solution in Yugoslavia was probably not inevitable, because it was stopped once before in the early 70s, of course in very different circumstances, but still. I will have to.
You will have to
start.
Thank you very much. Really. You used your time very productively. Now I would like to invite you to ask questions, if you have any, or Catherine, if you would like to reply to what Marko said.
It's not a reply, but a comment, but perhaps, I don't know if... I think it should have been better that Marko begins, in fact, because it introduces notions and so on which are very useful for the discussion. But anyway, I don't know, yeah.
Yes, Gibanju from radio student. David A. Diker, in his book Yugoslavia, Socialism, Development, and Debt, writes that one of the failures, one of the missing things in when the workers decided their own wages was that this created inflationary pressures and that too little money was invested in the development of factories. How would you counter that?
I have a broader comment or question. Thank you.
Go on. Go on. Yes, please.
A ne bo njemu odgovorila.
Prosim?
A bo njemu
Ne
odgovorila.
skupaj, rekel, da
A
bi
skupaj?
Profesor je rekel, da je on dokumentar, da naj najprej odgovori na vprašanje, ne? Pa bo bolj komentiral, ja.
He has a commentary, so
you may
he's proposing to ask
Well, I
you
mean,
to answer the
this is
question
a-
first, and then-
I think the real issue is precisely that you have no space to control. There is a need in any society, and it's true in the capitalist society, by the way, but in any transitional society or society which wants to build socialism, there is a need of equilibrium between what you produce and the money you distribute. It is not true that the spontaneous decision-making of workers would be the same if they had a space to decide which is not limited to their narrow factory. Even in that case, it is not proven that the workers confronted with the problem to choose increasing wage or giving money for funds always decided to increase wage. It was not the case. But it is true that inflation and disequilibrium are unavoidable if you limit the horizon of management at the level of the factory. That's true.
Well, I would just, I don't think that assertion is wrong. Probably it's just a little bit simplistic. Because I think there are theoretical simulations, so to say, that were done by Yugoslav economists, for instance, Filip Lipovec in Slovenia, but also people from like Otošik and others from the Eastern Bloc, that were then also confirmed by the empirical development in Yugoslavia, at least, that, you know, if you give the workers in a certain firm or enterprise the power, the authority, and you don't supplement it with a mechanism of planning, then what would happen would be that the workers would, of course, normally try to increase their rate of income. They would try to earn more by doing the same amount of work, or work less and earn the same, basically. So, if you would and if the only decision-making authority would be the separated firms, then each one would act egoistically, I would say, increasing their income rate normally. But, as Lipovec has shown, increasing the income rate would not be sufficient to reproduce the economy, because, and that's the importance of why I was saying, while I was talking about accumulation in capitalism. If individual capitalists behaves egoistically, trying to increase his rate of profit, this is good for the system as a whole, because this is also the way of increasing accumulation. Because for the capitalist, workers, labor costs, this is all costs. He wants to reduce them because he wants to increase profit, and that's good for the system. The less that is used for the workers' reproduction, the more can be used for investment. But, of course, in capitalism, in self-managed firm, the workers' collective wants to increase their income rate. And for them, accumulation that it has to give to society or social funds or the bank, of course, are only costs or detrimental to their own, let's say, egoistic interest. And that's what was actually happening, especially in this phase of market socialism. This, people call it grupno-lastniški tendency. Yeah? So people behaving in a firm like they're their owners, only looking for their short-term interests. And that's why we need planning in the market system. That's why it is not enough to have just self-management or workers' management in the firms, but still have capitalist relations between the firms, because then the workers' collectives would be behaving like capitalists themselves. And just to conclude, I think there is some empirical evidence that this was the case, this kind of discrepancy, and it has shown itself not only in inflation, but also this phenomenon of socialist unemployment. Because they wanted to increase their rate of income, they wanted to have more capital in order to do the same amount of work with less laborers, because then the income would be divided by less people. And that's why, okay, they were not allowed to dismiss people as they are now, the firms and the management, but they were free to not hire people. And that's why in this third phase, after the reform of '65, the growth of employment dropped, and in certain years, even the number of workers has been reduced.
Do we have any more questions before we go to the long comment? Yes?
I would like you to compare a little Yugoslavia and self-management reforms with China, because I think in some cases they are similar in the sense that both introduced market, and in some aspects are completely different. Like some aspects of self-management are like democratic from bottom up, and in China it's in some cases it seems to be completely different. It's from top down all the and so.
The present China for me is a capitalist system. I mean, really, I don't think it was not.
But it was communist, right?
No, but I don't think there was never. You see, Yugoslavia broke with Stalin claiming to go back towards Marx and the Commune de Paris, the Paris Commune, introducing self-management. The Chinese broke with the Soviet against Khrushchev, but claiming Stalin was the model. So they never introduced self-management, and they even criticized Yugoslavia as a capitalist system because Stalin has said it was a capitalist. So I mean, so there was some period and some local experience where during the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai and so on, where there were some elements of real self-management introduced. But anyway, it was instrumentalized from the top and very limited in time. And I mean, the China system transformed afterwards in a very radical system where the protection of workers against the pressure of competition and market is no more existing in the sense of any kind of self-management or even. So I mean, I don't see there a real efficient comparison. I think really that there is a system where you have it is a case where I would say that it's a combination of state, state party bureaucracy, bourgeois bureaucracy, and different sectors, the one open to work capitalism and some other more protected. But even in the part which are more protected, there is no self-management rights. So I don't.
Yeah, I agree, but why are they then so successful if they introduced exactly those measures that were detrimental to Yugoslavia?
Why
are they so successful?
Well, the problem is how do you judge success?
I mean, there were superpower in Yugoslavia dissolved in the World War.
No, I mean, there has been increasing and even reduction of poverty in China and so on. There have been the phase of where they have transformed agriculture, which increased also productivity, but they were very much in a condition to not to destroy the Chinese. I'm not sure I understand what period of China you want to comment. I'm not sure I understand your question, because are you questioning about the China's successes, which are in the capitalist transformation, or are you questioning another period of the Chinese system under the Maoist leadership? I'm not sure I understand.
Exactly the middle. I question about the Deng Xiaoping reforms and about that. It seems to me that he introduced exactly those measures that were introduced in Yugoslavia and lead to Yugoslavian collapse, like free market, capitalism.
Precisely, they did not introduce free market. They didn't suppress the control. There is a strong control of the Chinese system of its, even of its foreign trade. There is a strong emphasis even of the banking system to support Chinese factories, not to privatize systematically like it was done. So there is a combination of features which are far from any kind of socialist transformation, but which are not at all liberal capitalism, and neither at all the kind of destruction of the Soviet system which existed under Yeltsin, for instance, and even in Yugoslavia in the 90s. There is a strong state which centralized choices in a very with a very dictatorship. It's not so but no protection of workers' rights. But in spite of that, the success which are real are the fact that there has been an increasing of living standard for a huge part of the population, even. And there has been the possibility for the Chinese system to resist IMF or those kind of pressure, because they were controlling their own system, and instead of having debt in their trade, they had the surplus. So it's a condition of a capitalist transformation with a strong state control. So, I mean, you can describe some successes, but not on the point of view of workers' rights and workers' statute and socialist conditions. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Any more questions?
I have to use the same disclaimer which I used to open my first intervention. I mean, it's hard to say anything meaningful about Yugoslav socialism in 20 minutes.
Chinese Yugoslav.
So yeah, whereas it's a fortiori also valid for the Chinese case, but still, for the comparison that you make. We all agree that after the socialist revolution executed by peasant and workers' masses in China, by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, there was a break with capitalism, liquidation of former ruling classes, physical sometimes as well, but also, most importantly, the conditions for reproduction of former exploitative classes of aristocracy, bourgeoisie, and all Chinese bureaucracy. And, of course, the country entered the path to socialism. At a certain point, and I'm not an expert on China, it reached a similar turning point, I would say, that every socialist society reaches. There is certain limitations of this type of rude administrative bureaucratic planning, which becomes detrimental to the development of the country and the living standard of the working people. Because, as I've said before, bureaucracy is not a social class. The conditions of what is good for their reproduction, what is good for their privileges, is not good for the economic development of the country as such. So the countries, at a certain point, every country of that type faces a dilemma. What is to be done to move forward? As I mentioned, and as Catherine describes in the book, basically there are basically two options. One is to radicalize the revolution, give power to the working people, get rid of the bureaucracy, rationalize the economy, mostly by removing bureaucracy from the positions of determining what are the social needs, how will they be met, moving them away from stealing the surplus that could be productive use and stuff like that. That's one way. And the second way is the reintroduction of capitalism. But this can be done at least in two different ways we know now. One way was performed in Yugoslavia and in the Russian Federation as well. So this means primitive, violent primitive accumulation of social or state-owned enterprises and wealth, and re-establishment of pure capitalism and capitalist class who, via privatization, denationalization, processes like that, becomes more or less classical capitalists, of course, in less developed countries. So you can compare, I don't know, Serbia, Kosovo to Bangladesh or Pakistan, but that's the same social system. Yeah? Or you can do what I think the Chinese ruling strategy, to use their power to increase the rate of exploitation of the working class. The success that you are mentioning, and which is true, it is a success in a way, of modernization of China and of its growth of its GDP, is to a certain extent, or it's mostly due to the ability of the Chinese ruling classes to increase the rate exploitation to a level that cannot be imagined even in Slovenia or even in Serbia, nevertheless in Canada or, I don't know, France or Belgium, whatever. Right? So my hypothesis, which is a working hypothesis because it came to me right now, is that in China, bureaucracy actually did become a true class, social class. What is good for their reproduction of the production of wealth is good also for the Chinese growth. It has powers that Western capitalists don't have. It has means that Western capitalists don't have, but they use them basically in the same way to strengthen the apparatus of the state and to strengthen their personal wealth. They have a lot of ways how to, the socialist apparatchiks from Soviet Union and Yugoslavia never had, how to privatize the wealth, not formally, but still, but at least informally. How to, you know, channel the income of the state-owned or formerly state-owned companies to their own pockets. So that's my view of what happened of what's happening in China, and that's why some people, at least Trotsky's Marxists, say we have a new type of capitalism existing in China, bureaucratic capitalism, and this is what it means: a new ruling class, bureaucracy. First, bourgeois type of bureaucracy, but still bureaucracy, not a classical,
Very specific.
bourgeoisie.
Very specific.
Any more questions? Yes.
I have a comment if I may.
Só uma conversa.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thanks for
He
helping.
also can.
Please. Yes.
I also have a question, but some, let's say, broader comment. I'm very sorry that I didn't have a chance to read the book, but I am very close to your preoccupations, and in a way it's giving me support and courage to my own efforts, what I am doing. Being in a privileged position, I was counting myself just now how many years back I could remember relevance to the topic and to French collection, I would say. It was 1959, 60, when in Belgrade, at the Institute of Social Sciences, sociologists from potekal, the titre pratique, Deloche, Albert Meister, you know, probably,
Yes.
Albert Meister, and so on, were interested in self-management in the broader context of collaborative movements, kibbutz in Israel, and so on. So Yugoslavia was at that time quite attractive area for many abroad, and this was then, as you know, praxis movement and so on. Now, more concretely, no, in a way it was mutual. We went to France and they were presenting the experience of Communauté du Travail, New York, etc. Albert Meister later on, first we were doing a survey in Serbia on work in factories and so on. He later on turned to very negative kind of frontal rejection of Yugoslav experiment and so on. In a way similar to what happened after 90s here in Slovenia. My colleague Veljko Rus and myself maybe very similarly had a different view on that. No, I would just mention I'm preparing a book also more retrospective on how sociology was dealing with self-management, on how we were writing at that time, and we are not really, like it looks, we should be ashamed to deal with such topics. This is changing also with the support of such work as yours. But something contradictory is happening concerning our past. I think a younger generation, with the exception of what Professor Prasko and followers are doing, were not really introduced in this past. We have new, that's a new era today. And we can find, but what can we find? Let's say a new thing appears in, to take a little broader, in public sociology in US. And as a new idea, although I would argue we were doing public sociology 30, 40, 50 years back, or in terms of planning, spatial planning, let's say Netherlands, very popular, self-organization. But has this self-organization planning any connection with self-management? They come just close to that, but not really into it. So we are importing today in the area of previous Yugoslavia new ideas from outside, which are not really so new for us. Kind of contradiction. But to make a long story short, I would come back to the question about France, but let's in terms of sociology, you probably would agree with me that there is kind of paradox in sociology dealing with long-term developmental trends, where you don't find anymore in sociology the concept of socialization. You find it only in social psychological sense, but not in a Marxist sense of socialization of production or something. If you look at dictionaries of sociology, you don't find socialization in dictionaries anymore in that sense. Only in the Marxist literature, maybe. So, paradox. What seems to, and self-management, I take self-management just as a component of this broad long-term processes of empowerment of and so on. Would you, just to conclude, would you comment please, in addition to your views today and your research and your preoccupation, what is the situation in France today? How lonely you are in your preoccupations, or how much you share with others, and maybe some comments on your and my comments. Thank you.
Perhaps, I don't know if
No,
there is...
it's okay.
First, I'm very pleased to listen to your comments, and I wanted to say that the word socialization is more and more used in a part of the radical left, at least, who want to dissociate from etatization, and even nationalization is to be the concept of nationalization. To continue the distinction you make, there can be nationalization in the capitalist and bourgeois system, and there can be nationalization in a non-capitalist but with etatization form. So in order to have a critical approach against the attempt of etatization or of even subordination of nationalization to bourgeois interest, the concept of socialization is more and more used. As the idea in France, for instance, not only very broadly. I mean, the idea that the ownership, there should be also a social appropriation, social control, socialization, for instance, of public service, socialization of factories. That is. The word itself, of course, is not sufficient, but the idea using this term is to introduce the idea of social control, and social control coming both from workers working in the different sector of factories, but also it can come from user, from trade unionists. So, I mean, there is that idea of the need of empowerment, the need of capacity to control, but with a critical approach of something which would identify, in fact, control with statist control or bureaucratic control or technocratic control. So this important aspect. I want to say that when you comment the fact that there are lots of experience. I'm of course in France and involved in political activity, association and so on in France. But since half a century, I am in fact involved in international network. I'm international political organization, international network of economists, international network of association. I am involved in an association called Association Self-Management in France, which is part of an international network having no limitation, geographical limitation, but which is interested in gathering, mutualizing on website and also in conferences all past and present experiences linked to workers' control, self-management, and not only as a local but also as resistance against the system. So it can be within capitalist system but against it, like it could have been in other contexts. And you can find that, I can give you, you can find that in the, under it's called the Workers' Control Point Net. And the international network is linked with conferences called the Workers' Political Economy, Workers' Political Economy, and began in Latin America. So when you say, and you are right, that many experiences which are close, in fact, with the concrete utopia which was raised in Yugoslavia are occurring elsewhere and can occur elsewhere. And of course you don't need the knowledge of the Yugoslav experiment to have, in fact, the universal aim that was linked with the Yugoslav self-management, that is the idea that workers, peasants, people should control their own labor, and this control should not be only in their factory, in their unit, but socialized at a broader level. So there is a broad debate on that. So in France, this association autogestion do exist, and I'm involved in that. And it has organized a conference in the factory in the south of France, Marseille. The Fravit, they produce tea, and it was a part of a multinational producing such a product. But they broke with this, and they transformed their factory into a cooperative. But the problem is, there again, we should distinguish the use of the term self-management of workers' control in the context of a capitalist system, which is a mode of resistance, and it can be distorted. Your cooperative and factories which have been taken back by workers in Argentina, in Greece, in France, and so on, are still confronted to an hostile system and to competition, which is not only the type of competition that the Yugoslav system had in the 60s, but a real capitalist competition with the pressure of international treaties, of international multinational firms, which try to impose rules and so on. So the discussion is again limited time. So, but the discussion which is interesting is how to use control of factory in different control of production, control of services in different contexts as a tool to resist to the system. But I would say with the risk of being obliged to adapt to the system, And so to avoid that risk, one of important aspect of a process of socialization and of commonizing the experience is the building of international networks, links between factory links, territorial links between rebel cities, also inside Via Campesina, among the peasants, there is a strong capacity now to integrate within the peasants' international network of resistance to globalization, to cross issue against multinational agricultural factories, and to resist to answer to environmental issue, social issue, women issue, anti-racist issue, both in the resistance. So that's a point. But I would have liked if there is time to make some comments on the contribution, or perhaps if there are other questions and comments. Yes, you wanted, yeah.
I think that the real challenge of capitalism always was not how to produce goods and services, but how not to, in every 10 or some years, come into a crisis which shows that capitalism has no internal mechanism to prevent the crisis. And every next crisis can be bigger than the former ones. So I think that the socialism has no choice. It has to answer the question how to prevent crisis economy, how to make a so-called social reproduction really successful and in accordance with the needs of the people. Because even the capitalism has to serve the needs of the people. Because if they don't do it, they just cannot sell what they have produced, and here we are in the problem. And I think that Yugoslav socialism was the only one which tried in the 70s, not in the 60s, in the 70s, with the concept of so-called integral self-governance, to include all the elements of decision-making of the people for not only for the decisions what we will produce in the factory and how much we can give for we can give for the wages and how much for the accumulation and improvement, but also how much we can have for culture, for education, for healthcare. So these were the questions which were put to the people to decide about. But it was a fake in the sense that they could not really decide about, because the decisions were taken elsewhere. They were taken within the executive body of the party. And because the country was so complicated in the sense of development, you know, the difference between Kosovo and Slovenia was 6 times. The GDP of Kosovo and Slovenia, for example, the difference was 6 times. So to make a country which will function with really needed state interventions, political interventions, and it will be good. At the same time, for Kosovo and for Slovenia, this was a very difficult thing to do. But I don't want to apologize for the debacle, for the end of this system. But I think that we are still in the square one, thinking about the future socialism. If we do not think about this, how to solve this problem of production and self-governance at the local, or if you want, industrial unit level, and self-governance at the level of the whole social reproduction. And the problem is even bigger, because now, in the times when we were young, Yugoslavia seemed to be big enough to be able to create a system like that and to control it by the state. Now it's impossible. There is not one country in the world which can do it independently. Not even China, not even USA, not even Russia. They all are interdependent. And the production, we don't know who is on the top. State bureaucracies or multinational companies. And how much the state is just the tool in the hands of the biggest multinationals. in our cases, in our economy, I'm sure that nation state is too small, too big, and we can't solve the problems with it. Even if it is bigger and stronger, we can't really answer to this without international connections, communications. In fact, the story of the global revolution is again on the table. Not a revolution in one country. It's impossible.
I fully agree with this comment. It's more than ever true that it's impossible to... first, that there are two aspects which are similar to the situation in the beginning of the 20th century. First, that there is a global... in both cases, there was a global system. In the First World War, the Second World War, and so on, there was a crisis of a global system, which was imperialist, that is an articulation between the power of decision-making of the core countries and the subordination of the national bourgeoisie in the peripheral situation. So that the resistance, both the crisis was global, with inter-imperialist wars, the fascism with different, and the resistance had to be also articulated. That's the point. That is articulated from the local to the global, and that was why the Third International was built. But the problem is the bureaucratization of the revolutions and of that Third International, and how to solve this issue. And I think today we are still confronted first to a globalized system which is in deep crisis, in fact, a crisis of civilization, I would say, which combine environmental and socio-economical issues. You say they need to sell, so to satisfy needs, but in fact they are confronted to the very deep conflict, control. That is the main dimension of the new phase of the capitalist system, was to destroy precisely the strength of labor and all collective means of increasing not only wages but capacity of control of labor in different parts of the world, in the capitalist system or in the socialist system. So that the political program of neo-capitalism as a system was the destruction of labor power and how to sell. So the financialization of the system had been a limited and contradictory attempt to answer to this problem. So distribution of credit to poor or middle class impovered families and so on, and the crisis of the subprime in 2008 in the US, and the international result of this distribution of credit to poor peasants or people it is a disaster, because increasing of indebtedness, and not suppression, of course, of oppression, but the contrary. But it is neither a capacity of the financial system, capitalist system, to control its own crisis. So we are before very rapid new financial crisis, and in incapacity of stabilization. So we are in what Gramsci described as the old world is dying, the new alternative has very big difficulty to be born, and in between you have monsters. So, but we have not only monsters. So to be a little bit more positive, you have monsters like Trump, you have monsters like the far right everywhere, increasing fascist and xenophobic comments and so on. But you have also resistance. But then we are confronted to what you say, a strategical issue, which is even much more complex now than it was in the beginning of the 20th century. So I would not avoid the local and national resistance at all. We cannot wait for everyone fighting together. But we must permanently, and that is my concept, we must work first to organize and to build what is needed in front of the globalized capitalism. That is resistance at all levels of decision making. So national, European, continental, Latin American, African, European is a strategical issue. And international, of course. We have to defeat the treaties which they try to impose. We have to defeat the multinationals' power, and we cannot do it only, like you say, only nationally, but we can resist nationally, but not alone. So we must both try to build as much as possible relationship of force of resistance in the different conditions of national resistance. France is not Slovenia, Slovenian is not Greece, and so on. But the European Union itself is in crisis. We must neither underestimate its strength nor overestimate its strength and its legitimacy. I am involved in a network which has a very radical critical approach of the existing European Union and of its treaties, because it is based on the financial market and to satisfy them and to suppress democracy, like the Greek people could see. Bon. So I do believe that building a resistance to that means a confrontation to the existing treaties and to existing institutions of the European Union. But then you have the choice either to think, and I think it's an illusion, that the national come back to the national currency and national decision making would give you any kind of real sovereignty, real kind of control. And in general, this line is combined. It's not always the case, but in general, it's combined with the idea of that building your own protection against a foreigner, that is a xenophobic and racist view. Or you refuse this and you resist nationally, you defend national rights, but you show, and it's very easy to show. I have here Alter Summit, for instance, which is a network in Europe based on trade unions and associations and rank and files and so on. There is the network built around the idea of communizing Europe through democratic and egalitarian rebellion and recommons Europe, and that is the idea to fight within, against, and outside the existing European Union to build another kind of Europe that is linked even with Ukrainian, the Russian, those who are not in Bosnia and so on, those who have the euro and those who have not the euro, but to say finances, money, and political power must be submitted to social control, socialization of the choices, and the protection of fundamental needs, which are very simple to explain. Needs for education for everyone, for housing, for health, and dignity, which is a synthetic demand, which has been expressed in the Arabic world and in Latin America or here in the past and so on. The control of water, the control of land for peasants, and so on, with democracies. And democracy is not elections without choices, and where the key the key fundamental choices are taken outside of parliaments, and even those elected in parliament are not controlled. So that's the issue, and that is.
Thank you very much. I was told that the room is free until 8 o'clock, but I think we really need fresh air. And there is also a television who wants to speak with you, to make a short interview with
But
you.
the debate is more important than television, no? If you want.
But if you have very precious questions, comments, and so on, we can continue, whatever you like. It is up to our common choice, so we can practice self-management here.
You
at
can
home.
go to my website also and continue the discussion directly also. You can use all what I've produced, but we can discuss, and I can give you more information of what I've been, like Marko said, it's absolutely impossible to answer to those issues in a few minutes. So, I mean, links can be established for discussion going on afterwards also.
Okay.
Do you cooperate with the MPA or any other party, or have you been invited
Yes,
to
I cooperate. I am a member of Radical Left different components and involved in Alter. I'm a member of ATTAC also in France, and that is the Alter Mondialist, the resistance to globalization system. And I am involved in international, which is very small also, but which is part of precisely the components that should be together in order to try and answer. So I'm in France. You were saying, I hope in the 26th there will be some efforts coming from trade unions or political currents, be there in the France Insoumise or in NPA or in anarchist or in other currents, but or not organized people, but to build something which permits the convergence between student struggles against the dominant trends to privatize, in fact, university access and so on, and railway workers, which in fact represent in France the resistance also against privatization of public services in de facto under different forms. And this is to be combined also with the resistance to racist trends which are important in France, on Islamophobia and different combination also, where you can cross inside the mobilization also the fight against all caste oppression, that is women issues. Women have been highly mobilized also on March 8th and so on, in Spain, in France and so on. So that's the case. I'm involved in those networks.
Okay, thank you.
In that case, I thank you both of our speakers and for you to stay with us so long in such a hot environment. Now we can go to drink something together and continue our debate privately, one-to-one person. Thank you very much.
Thank you.